Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. I'm on your TV and radio. So the Labour Party has released figures claiming that more than 23,000 patients died in A&E last year. The party obtained the figures through a Freedom of Information request and points to an increase of 4,000 more deaths than the previous year. Joining me now is Health and Social Affairs Editor at the Sunday Express newspaper, Lucy Johnston. Lucy, thank you for joining me this afternoon. These are shocking figures, 4,000 more deaths than last year. We've also seen excess deaths abnormally high, aren't we, across the NHS, not just due to A&E failures. What do you put this down to?
Well, these figures are very interesting, and there's been some speculation over a long period about how many people are dying, extra deaths in A&E waits, and the numbers have been put as high as about 500 a week at one point. But the excess, the extra deaths, the unexpected deaths that we've been seeing post-pandemic have been steadily accumulating, and it seems to be that this is not letting up. So we've done a bit of a calculation recently showing that just last year we had 10% more deaths than the 5-year average, and actually we had more deaths than the pandemic year, or more extra non-COVID deaths than the pandemic year of 2021. So there were 67,000 extra or unexpected deaths last year, and most of those were not COVID, but about a quarter of them were COVID. Most of them weren't. And the government has failed, after repeated calls from various experts around the country, has failed to launch any proper investigation into why this is happening. And as you can see from the figures you've got here today about A&E waits, part of this is likely to be down to the healthcare service and the long waits, particularly in A&E.
Huge demand on the service, of course, and there have been long calls for reform of the NHS in one way or another. But these excess deaths may well be COVID-related, mightn't they, insofar as they are due to late diagnoses that never took place during the pandemic because the National Health Service was overcome by COVID cases, or essentially became the National COVID Service for many months, I would argue. So this is a knock-on from that time, is it not, Lucy?
Well, yes, and in fact, yeah, it's not caused by COVID, but in fact it's caused by, potentially, we think, a lot of it, our response to COVID. And interestingly, in Sweden, which had a much lighter lockdown, where they didn't close the healthcare service and people were able to get treatment, and other countries where these changes to the health services weren't made, they don't have this problem. In fact, I think Sweden has one of the lowest number of excess deaths or extra deaths in Europe. There has been some analysis of the deaths, and although we don't know what's driving the deaths themselves, why people are developing the problems, but they seem to be mostly related to heart disease and diabetes, which does suggest that delayed diagnosis and delayed treatment could be part of the problem. There's also emerging, and I've had a look at some figures recently, a new wave of extra cancer deaths, and these deaths will take a long time or longer time to go through the system because it takes more time for cancers to develop and for people to sadly die of cancer. But we're starting to see these grow now, and the frightening thing is these won't be just deaths due to delays in treatment, but if there isn't an urgent reform of the health service, there will be wave upon wave of extra cancer deaths on top of these other extra deaths that we're already seeing. Back last year, Chris Whitty blamed the extra deaths on the fact that there were reduced prescriptions for statins during the pandemic, and that's why there were so many heart disease deaths. But actually, a study by Oxford scientists has found that there was no reduced prescriptions for statins. So it really does need digging into properly, and we need urgent action. And I'm not sure why there hasn't been any to date.
Yes, it does. It does. I mean, many people will be asking exactly the same question. Looking at the number of deaths, it is terrifying for people who will potentially have to use the NHS. Most of us will have to, for one reason or another, in a life-threatening stage of our life. But I don't know if you've seen, but Keir Starmer has come out in The Telegraph, known for being a conservative publication. He's saying clever reform can change the trajectory of the NHS. If we cut unnecessary bureaucracy and provide a clear route for innovators into the NHS, the results could be profound. This is what I would expect to hear from a Conservative Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, there has been reform after reform of the NHS. And I think one of the problems that leaders in the NHS complain about is that no one actually gets around and lets doctors get on with what they feel they need to do. There seems to be a lot of meddling by politicians who talk to the BMA or talk to unions and decide what is best. But actually, the BMA is there to look after its members. That's its main priority. And reform is often just tinkering around the edges. What needs to happen potentially is it needs an overhaul, not just a reform. So we do need to see potentially weekend work, because the fact that consultants are largely not there at the weekend bunches up the number of the flow, or there's a difficult flow during the week. We do have a problem with social care that is not given as much money as the NHS, and so people are not looked after at home and they can't be discharged from hospital as a result of that. And because there's not enough care in people's homes, they end up in hospital. So that's an area which is often ignored. And another area which
Lucy, I mean, you talk about it's an area. Sorry to interrupt, but it's an area that's been so long ignored, but something that comes up time and time again. And I fear that whatever government we have, it will be tinkering around the edges, a bit more money here and there, a few little changes here. Old pharmacists can give you antibiotics now, and blah, 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 blah. And we remain with the same, in my opinion, failed system of healthcare. But there you go. Thank you very much indeed, Lucy Johnston, the Health and Social Affairs Editor at the Sunday Express, taking us through some of those shocking statistics that Labour have dug up. 23,000 deaths in A&E last year alone, up on the previous year quite significantly.